The sound of glassware clinking still echoes in my head. I can see the shimmer of chandeliers reflecting off polished wood floors, the smell of champagne laced with gardenias from the centerpieces, and the soft murmur of guests dressed in their best. That evening was meant to honor my father-in-law's long career, a family gathering full of pride and celebration. But what I remember most isn't the speeches or the applause. It's the way my husband leaned close to another woman's ear, his hand lingering at the small of her back, as though the rest of us had ceased to exist. My chest tightened as I watched their laughter ripple across the table, and in that moment, a quiet crack ran through the life I thought I knew. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and don't forget to like and subscribe if these family stories resonate with you. My name is Elena Brooks. I'm 46 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life working as a counselor at the local high school. The kind of job that doesn't come with glamour, but carries a sense of purpose. My husband Mark is 2 years older, a regional sales director, who has always carried himself with the easy confidence of a man used to closing deals. Together, we built a modest but steady life, raising our daughter Lily in a quiet suburban neighborhood where weekend barbecues and late-night homework sessions defined our rhythm. I believed, perhaps naively, that loyalty and hard work were the cornerstones of our marriage. My upbringing taught me to value stability above all else. My parents were teachers who saved carefully and believed every promise spoken beneath their roof should be kept. When I married Mark, I thought I had chosen a man with the same foundation. He was ambitious, sometimes restless, but he made me laugh and filled our home with energy. For nearly 2 decades, we built a life brick by brick, our milestones marked by family photos, holiday traditions, and Lily's growing footsteps echoing through the halls. At first glance, nothing about our marriage appeared fragile. Mark's job gave us comfort, while my steady income offered security. We hosted family dinners, sent out Christmas cards, and even helped plan community events. On the outside, we were the couple others pointed to with admiration, the kind people assumed had it all figured out. But even the strongest walls can hide tiny fractures, hairline cracks invisible until pressure makes them spread. Looking back, I can see the signs were there. Mark's business trips became longer, his phone glued to his hand more often than not. He brushed off my concerns with smooth reassurances, the kind that sound reasonable until you realize you're being managed, not heard. I told myself it was stress, the demands of his position, or simply the natural distance that creeps into long marriages. Still, unease settled into my chest like a stone. The night of Walter's retirement gala crystallized that unease into something sharper. It wasn't only Mark's closeness to Tessa, my oldest friend since college, the woman who had planned the entire event. It was the ease between them, the unspoken language of 2 people who had crossed a line they could never uncross. I watched their silhouettes framed against the glow of the ballroom, and in that instant, the surface harmony of our life no longer felt safe. I didn't speak. I didn't make a scene, but something inside me shifted. By the time the evening ended, the guests applauding Walter's farewell speech and the band playing its last song, I had plastered on a smile so convincing, even Lily believed it. Yet my mind was racing, gathering fragments of memory and suspicion into a truth I could no longer bury. The life that seemed so steady now rested on quicksand, and I sensed it wouldn't be long before it all collapsed beneath me. After the gala, I told myself I might have imagined it. People lean close at crowded events. Laughter can sound different depending on the angle. But the image of Mark's hand resting too comfortably on Tessa's back wouldn't leave my mind. That night, when we drove home in the quiet hum of the car, I noticed how Mark kept the radio loud enough to fill the silence. He didn't reach for my hand, not once, and when we pulled into the driveway, he stepped out first, already scrolling through his phone. The days that followed should have been ordinary. I still rose early, made coffee-packed Lily's lunch, and slipped into my counselor's chair at school. Yet nothing felt steady anymore. Mark's absences multiplied, his explanations rehearsed and thin. A late client dinner, a delayed flight, a hotel mix-up that kept him an extra night away. He offered each excuse with the calm tone of a man who had practiced them long before I asked. I started to notice smaller things. His phone never left his side, carried even from room to room. He angled the screen away whenever a message appeared, sometimes smiling faintly before tucking it back into his pocket. The passwords on his laptop and tablet suddenly changed. At dinner, he'd leave the table mid-meal to take calls outside, his voice drifting back through the porch screen, low but animated. I tried to tell myself it was business. Still, the knot in my stomach tightened every time. One evening, while Lily finished homework at the kitchen table, I set down a casserole and called for Mark. He didn't answer, though his car sat in the driveway. I found him upstairs in the guest room, speaking softly into the phone. He turned when he saw me in the doorway, his expression hardening in an instant. "Work call," he said, snapping the phone shut. But no sales manager I knew spoke in that tender, coaxing tone. I didn't confront him, not then. Years of working with teenagers had taught me that direct accusations rarely revealed the truth. Instead, I waited, watching more closely, listening between words. That patience carried me through the next weeks, but it also hollowed me out. I found myself staring at the ceiling at night, the warmth of Mark's body beside me no longer comforting, but foreign, as though I were lying next to a stranger. Pamela, a fellow counselor at school, noticed my weariness. Over lunch one afternoon, she leaned closer, her voice gentle. "You seem tired, Elena. Is everything all right at home?" I hesitated, then shrugged it off, unwilling to give shape to my suspicions. But she squeezed my hand, her eyes steady. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Her words stayed with me long after the bell rang and students filled the halls again. The first undeniable crack came on a Thursday evening. Mark had told me he would be late, claiming a dinner meeting at a downtown steakhouse. I didn't expect him home until after 10, but around 8, while Lily studied upstairs, I stepped outside to bring in the mail. That's when I saw his car turn the corner, headlights cutting across our yard. He parked quickly and slipped inside, startled when he found me in the foyer. "Meeting ended early," he said, loosening his tie. Yet I smelled the faint trace of perfume on his jacket. "Not mine, not anything familiar." He tossed his jacket across the back of the sofa and disappeared upstairs to shower, leaving me frozen in place. My pulse pounded, every doubt I had nursed now throbbing in full. When he returned, freshly scrubbed and casual in a t-shirt, he kissed my cheek as if nothing had happened. I smiled faintly, masking the ache in my chest, but inside, I knew I couldn't pretend forever. The following weekend brought another sting. Lily had a choir rehearsal at the community center, and I stopped by the grocery store on my way to pick her up. In the parking lot, while I loaded bags into the trunk, I spotted Tessa across the street. She wore a dress I had never seen, her hair styled in loose waves. She wasn't alone. Mark walked beside her, his hand brushing against hers, as though it were the most natural gesture in the world. They laughed, pausing only when a car passed between us. By the time I blinked, they had slipped into a cafe. I drove home in silence, groceries shifting in the back seat, my breath shallow. It wasn't a mistake this time, not a trick of light or an innocent misunderstanding. It was clear, undeniable, and it cut through me like glass. Yet when Mark returned home that night, carrying a bag of takeout and chatting about sports scores, I smiled again, setting plates on the table, listening to Lily's chatter. No storm erupted in our kitchen, no confrontation across the counter, just my quiet resolve hardening beneath the surface. That evening, when the house settled and Lily retreated upstairs, I sat at the dining table alone. The faint perfume still lingered in the air, clinging to the jacket Mark had draped carelessly across a chair. I closed my eyes, steadying myself, and realized the life I thought unshakable had already begun to fracture. The silence of that room pressed against me heavy and certain. I knew the first cracks had only just appeared, and deeper fault lines waited to split wide open. The weeks that followed blurred together heavy with silence I carried alone. At night, when the house fell still and Lily's door closed softly upstairs, I would lie awake listening to the steady rhythm of Mark's breathing beside me. That sound used to comfort me. Now it felt foreign, a reminder of the distance growing between us, a gap he no longer cared to bridge. I stared at the ceiling, rehearsing questions I never asked, swallowing tears before they reached my throat. In the mornings, I moved through the routine like a ghost. Coffee brewing lunches, packed keys jingling on the counter. It all unfolded as if nothing had changed, though inside, I felt hollow. Mark left earlier than usual, his suit pressed, and polished his cologne strong enough to linger after the door closed. Lily noticed my quietness, though she didn't press. She was 17, balancing choir rehearsals, college applications, and her own storm of emotions. I forced smiles for her sake, determined not to weigh her down with mine. At school, I hid behind the calm professionalism my job demanded. Students came to me with their heartbreaks and fears, and I offered the same steady counsel I'd always given. But there were moments sitting alone in my office between appointments when the weight pressed too hard. I'd open the blinds and let the afternoon sun spill across the carpet, just to remind myself the world was still turning outside the cage of my doubts. Pamela would sometimes peek in with a mug of tea. Her brow furrowed as she asked, "Rough day?" I always nodded, grateful for her kindness, but never spoke the full truth. It wasn't just the suspicion of Mark and Tessa that wore me down, it was the charade of normalcy. I hosted Sunday dinners as though nothing were wrong, arranging flowers in the kitchen while Mark carved roasts and told stories. Tessa sometimes joined us, her laughter carrying easily across the table. I watched them from the corner of my eye, searching for the subtle exchanges that confirmed what I already knew. A glance held too long. A private smile tucked into the corner of a sentence. They were careful, but not careful enough. I began to notice how Mark treated me differently when she was present. His tone softened, almost patronizing, as if I were an afterthought in my own home. When I tried to join conversations, he cut me off with a smooth quip, steering the attention back to Tessa. She basked in it, her hand resting lightly on the stem of her wine glass, her eyes glancing toward him more often than toward me. Each moment carved another line of doubt inside me. Yet I sat there, composed my face, revealing none of the storm within. In the privacy of my room, the mask would slip. I'd sit at my vanity long after the house went quiet, staring at my reflection as though searching for the woman I used to be. Some nights I cried softly, careful not to wake Lily. Other nights I sat motionless, too drained even for tears. I thought about the years I had given every holiday planned, every corner of our home shaped with care, and wondered if any of it mattered to him. The loneliness of that realization burned sharper than anger ever could. One Saturday morning, while folding laundry, I found a slip of paper tucked into the pocket of Mark's trousers. It was a receipt from a downtown boutique, a place I had never visited. A necklace expensive and delicate, purchased 2 days earlier. I held it in my hand, the ink smudged slightly from wear, and felt my stomach twist. He had not given me jewelry in years, not since our 10th anniversary. That receipt wasn't meant for me. I slipped it back into the pocket, folding the trousers neatly as though nothing had happened, but my hands trembled the entire time. I carried that secret receipt with me like a stone. Each time Mark kissed my cheek before leaving for another meeting, I remembered the weight of that paper in my hand. Each time he dismissed my questions with an easy smile, I remembered the necklace I would never wear. Still, I said nothing. Silence became my armor, my way of surviving one day at a time without shattering the fragile balance of our household. Pamela noticed the change in me more than anyone. One afternoon, as we locked up our offices, she paused in the hallway. "You've lost weight," she said quietly. "Are you eating?" I forced a smile, brushing her concern aside, but her eyes lingered on me with a mix of worry and suspicion. She didn't press, and I didn't offer, but her presence reminded me I wasn't entirely invisible. What haunted me most was Lily's innocence. She still believed in her father's steady devotion, still looked at him with trust unshaken. I caught her one evening at the piano playing softly, while Mark leaned against the doorway, his expression warm. For her, he could still play the role of a good father. I turned away, swallowing the ache that rose in my throat, unwilling to let her see the truth I carried. The quiet suffering stretched on a thread, pulling tighter each day. I told myself I endured for Lily for the sake of stability. But deep down, I knew it was also fear. Fear of what would happen if I spoke the truth aloud. My silence allowed Mark and Tessa to move freely, convinced they had outmaneuvered me. But beneath that silence, something inside me was hardening, preparing for the moment I would no longer pretend. And though I held my pain in the shadows, I could feel it shifting. It was no longer just sorrow, it was the beginning of resolve. The breaking point came in the smallest of moments. One evening, I stepped into the laundry room and found a note tucked into the pocket of Mark's jacket. It was written on Tessa's stationery, her looping script impossible to mistake. "Next Thursday, same place. Don't be late." My breath caught in my chest as I stood there, the hum of the dryer filling the silence around me. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was confirmation, undeniable and cruel in its simplicity. I pressed the note flat against the counter, my hands trembling. The ache I had carried in silence for weeks sharpened into something clearer, steadier. For months, I had buried my doubts, forcing myself to keep the peace for Lily's sake, but now the truth sat in front of me in black ink. I folded the note carefully and slid it into the back of my desk drawer, not ready to show anyone, but unwilling to let it vanish. That small slip of paper became the proof I needed, a thread that tied every doubt together into certainty. That night, as we sat down to dinner, I studied Mark with new eyes. He moved through the meal with casual charm, asking Lily about her day, telling a story about a difficult client, laughing at his own jokes. His performance might have fooled anyone else, but not me. I heard the hollow ring beneath his words, saw the quick glances at his phone resting beside his plate. When he excused himself to make a call, I remained at the table. My fork untouched the note's weight, pressing against me, even though it wasn't in my pocket. I lay awake for hours after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling in the dark. My mind no longer circled questions of if or maybe. It was clear, and the clarity hurt more than the uncertainty ever had. I thought of Lily upstairs, sleeping soundly, still trusting her father's steady presence. I thought of Tessa, the friend I had once trusted, with secrets now sneaking behind my back, with the man I had built a life beside. Anger and grief tangled inside me, but underneath them was something new, a rising determination I hadn't felt before. In the days that followed, I moved quietly, keeping my discovery to myself. At work, I focused on my students, grounding myself in their small triumphs and worries. Pamela noticed the change again, her eyes narrowing when she saw the exhaustion etched across my face. "You don't have to tell me," she said one afternoon, "but I can see you're carrying something heavy." I gave a faint smile, grateful for her care, but unwilling to reveal the full truth yet. I wasn't ready to share, not until I knew what I was going to do. The answer began to take shape at Walter's house the following weekend. We had gathered for a family dinner, a tradition he clung to even after retiring. Walter was a man who valued loyalty, the kind of father who built his reputation on keeping his word. As we cleared dishes from the table, Harold Kim stopped by. He had been Walter's friend for decades, a respected figure in the community, and someone who had always shown me kindness. He asked after my work, praised Lily's achievements, and spoke warmly about Walter's legacy. In their presence, I felt a flicker of the stability I once believed in. But as the evening unfolded, I caught sight of Mark and Tessa standing too close in the corner of the room, their heads bent together as though sharing a private joke. Walter didn't notice, but Harold's eyes followed mine, lingering on them longer than was polite. He said nothing, but the tightening of his jaw told me he had seen it too. That unspoken acknowledgement from someone outside my own mind steadied me. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't overreacting. Later that night when we returned home, Mark poured himself a drink and settled in front of the television. I excused myself, retreating to the bedroom where I finally let the tears come. But they weren't the same tears of helplessness I had shed weeks earlier. These were sharper, laced with the first threads of resolve. I no longer felt trapped in silence. I had the truth I had seen others notice, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I began writing small notes to myself, a habit I hadn't relied on since my college days. Dates, times, small details of conversations, things I could no longer trust my memory to hold steady. It wasn't about exposing him yet. It was about grounding myself, collecting pieces of the puzzle I had been forced to live inside. Each note was a reminder that I wasn't powerless, that I could shape the story instead of letting it shape me. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my journal open, the house wrapped in silence. I read through the scraps of evidence I had gathered, the perfume on his jacket, the receipt for jewelry, the note from Tessa. My hand trembled as I traced the words, but my heart steadied. The sorrow I had drowned in was giving way to clarity. I wasn't sure yet how I would move forward, but I knew one thing for certain: pretending ignorance was no longer an option. The next morning, as I watched Mark leave for work, I felt a strange calm settle over me. He kissed my cheek, his cologne sharp in the cool air, and I let him go without a word. But inside, I carried a new truth. The Elena who had endured silently was gone. A different version of me was beginning to rise, one who could no longer be ignored or dismissed. And though I hadn't spoken it aloud, the shift was already in motion. The first steps toward reclaiming myself had begun, and I sensed the day was coming when Mark and Tessa would finally see the woman they had underestimated. The morning after I slid Tessa's note into my desk drawer, I brewed coffee and stared out at the frost forming on our kitchen window. Mark came downstairs, phone in hand, suit pressed to perfection. He kissed my cheek lightly, the gesture automatic, before stepping out into the cold. I held the mug between my palms, waiting for the sound of his car to fade, then exhaled slowly. The stillness of the house felt different. It was no longer filled with my helplessness. It was filled with resolve. I began quietly in ways he wouldn't notice. At work, I spent lunch breaks organizing files he didn't know existed. Our mortgage documents, tax returns, Lily's college savings account. I stored copies in a separate folder at the school, hidden in the locked drawer of my office desk. It was the first step in untangling myself from the life he believed I couldn't live without. Each page I tucked away steadied me. I wasn't trapped. I was preparing. Pamela was the first person I trusted with a fraction of the truth. We sat in her office one afternoon, the blinds tilted to let in a pale beam of light. "You've been carrying something too heavy alone," she said, her voice gentle. I nodded, my throat tight, and though I didn't share names, I told her I had proof that my marriage wasn't what it appeared to be. She didn't press for details, only placed her hand over mine and said, "Then don't let anyone else write your story for you." Those words sank into me deeper than she knew. The next quiet step came through Walter. I visited him one Saturday under the pretense of bringing Lily by to help in his garden. As he showed her how to prune the roses, I wandered into his workshop, my eyes falling on the ledgers he kept for his small rental properties. Walter had always been meticulous with money, and his values stood like stone loyalty above all honesty as a foundation. Over dinner that evening, I let my words slip carefully. "You've always built things to last," I told him, watching his reaction. "Not everyone sees commitment that way." His jaw tightened, though he said nothing. Still, I knew the seed was planted. Mark continued his charade, unaware of the quiet lines I was drawing. He still claimed late dinners, still disappeared for hours on weekends, still smiled at me with that rehearsed warmth he thought I couldn't see through. But each time he walked out the door, I used the space he left behind. I called an attorney whose office sat in a brick building near the courthouse. A woman named Deborah Klein, recommended discreetly through a parent at school. I told Deborah I wasn't ready for divorce, but I needed to know where I stood. Sitting in her office, surrounded by neat stacks of case files, I felt the first flicker of control. Deborah explained how the house purchased partly with my inheritance after my mother's death was more mine than his. She pointed out that Lily's college fund was safe untouched by anything Mark might attempt. She advised me to document everything: financial irregularities, patterns of absence, even gifts that might have been purchased outside our household. I left her office with a folder of notes and a steadier heart. Quiet preparation was no longer just survival. It was strategy. One evening, while Mark showered, I slipped into his study. His laptop sat closed on the desk, but the drawer beneath it was slightly ajar. Inside, I found a receipt folded into quarters, a charge for a weekend stay at a lakeside inn 2 towns over. The date matched the weekend he had claimed to be in Chicago for a sales conference. My hands shook as I unfolded it, then carefully slid it into the pocket of my cardigan. I didn't confront him. Not yet. That piece would join the others, part of a picture only I was building. At dinner that night, he spoke breezily about the conference, describing imaginary meetings with colleagues. I nodded, chewing slowly, my face calm. Inside, I listened with a strange detachment, as though watching a performance I already knew the ending to. His lies no longer tore at me. They confirmed the strength of the wall I was quietly constructing. Meanwhile, I deepened my connection with Harold. A week later, he invited me to coffee to discuss a mentorship program he wanted to launch for high school seniors. We sat across from each other in a quiet corner of the cafe, steam curling from our cups. His eyes, sharp beneath his calm demeanor, studied me closely. "You've seemed different lately," he said. I hesitated, then allowed a small sigh. Sometimes it takes losing trust in one place to remind you where it still exists. He didn't ask further, but the understanding in his expression told me he had guessed more than I had said. The weight of secrecy pressed heavily, but it also fueled me. Each day, I balanced the role of mother, counselor, wife, while quietly preparing for the moment the truth would matter. I began moving small amounts of money into an account Mark didn't know about, telling myself it was for Lily's future. I changed the password to my email, updated the security on my phone, and shifted our family photos from the shared computer to a private drive. They were small actions, almost invisible, but together, They became my first acts of defiance. The final nudge came one night when Lily asked Mom, "Are you okay? You've been quieter lately." I looked at her across the dinner table, her earnest eyes filled with concern, and I forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired from work." She nodded, accepting the answer, but I knew I couldn't keep lying to her forever. She deserved better than to watch her mother fade under someone else's betrayal. That knowledge steadied me further. By the time February arrived, I no longer felt like a woman trapped in silence. I felt like a woman quietly sharpening her tools, gathering her strength. Mark still believed he controlled the story, still thought I was blind to the theater he staged with Tessa. But he didn't know about the files at school, the attorney's advice, the receipts and notes tucked safely away. He didn't know that each evening he stepped out into the night, I was laying the groundwork for the storm that would one day sweep him from the pedestal he thought unshakable. And as winter gave way to spring, I knew the time was approaching when silence would no longer be enough. The first steps had been taken. The next ones would not be quiet. The day everything shifted came in early spring at Walter's retirement banquet. It was held at the Whitmore Grand, a hall with sweeping staircases and glittering chandeliers, the kind of place where families dress their best and speak in polished tones. Lily wore a pale blue dress and looked radiant while I stood at the edge of the crowd watching the room fill with neighbors, business partners, and old friends. Mark arrived late, claiming a delayed flight, but he looked refreshed and polished as though he had been preparing for this evening in a very different way. As the speeches began, I noticed him scan the crowd until his eyes landed on Tessa. She stood near the front, clipboard in hand, playing the role of event planner. But when she caught Mark's gaze, her lips curved into a smile that lasted too long, a silent acknowledgement that didn't belong in public view. I saw Harold glance in their direction too, his expression tightening before he turned back to Walter's speech. That was when I knew the moment had come. It was no longer just my private burden. The truth was about to step into the open. When Walter finished speaking, applause thundered through the hall. Guests began mingling again, glasses clinking, waiters weaving through with trays. Mark excused himself from our table under the pretense of greeting a colleague. I followed discreetly, weaving through the crowd until I saw him stop at the edge of the stage where Tessa stood. They leaned close, heads nearly touching her hand, brushing his arm, as if they had forgotten where they were. I felt my pulse steady instead of quicken. For the first time, I wasn't overcome by fear. I was ready. I moved closer, close enough to hear fragments of their conversation. "Next weekend will be easier," Tessa whispered. Mark nodded, his eyes lighting with anticipation. In that crowded ballroom, surrounded by family and friends, they exposed themselves without realizing it. I turned and found Harold nearby speaking with Denise Wallace. He caught my eye, then glanced toward Mark and Tessa. When he saw my expression calm but deliberate, he gave a faint nod. He understood. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. During dinner, Walter insisted on a toast to family. He passed me the microphone first, asking me to speak about what loyalty and commitment meant. I rose, the weight of the room settling on me, and for a moment, I simply looked at Mark across the table. His smile was confident, smug, even certain that I would offer the same gentle words I always had. But I didn't. I spoke steadily, my voice carrying across the hall. I talked about trust, about the promises we make not just in marriages but in friendships, and how betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. It often begins quietly with secrecy and whispers. The room hushed as my words flowed, and I could see faces turning toward Mark and Tessa, confusion rippling into suspicion. I didn't name them outright, but I didn't have to. The silence that followed my toast spoke louder than names ever could. Mark shifted uneasily in his chair, his hand tightening around the stem of his glass. Tessa's face flushed crimson, her eyes darting toward the exits. Walter's gaze swept between them, sharp and unrelenting. Then Harold cleared his throat, adding his own words. "Commitment is the cornerstone of trust," he said firmly. "And when it's broken, it cannot be hidden for long." The message hung in the air, undeniable. For the rest of the evening, Mark tried to recover, laughing louder, greeting more guests, pretending nothing had changed. But I saw the way people glanced at him now, whispers rising at the edges of the room. Tessa kept to the sidelines, her usual confidence dimmed, her clipboard clutched like a shield. The web of secrecy they had spun was unraveling in public, and neither of them knew how to stop it. When we returned home, the confrontation I had avoided for months could no longer be postponed. Mark closed the door behind us and turned his voice sharp. "What was that tonight? Are you trying to humiliate me?" I set my purse down calmly and met his eyes. "I didn't humiliate you, Mark. You did that yourself." The words landed harder than any accusation. He froze, as though realizing for the first time that the script he had written for us was no longer mine to follow. He tried denial, his voice rising, as he insisted Tessa was just a friend, a colleague, someone he respected. I let him speak until his excuses tangled themselves. Then I pulled the folded note from my desk drawer, the one in Tessa's handwriting, and set it on the counter between us. His face drained of color. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of Lily moving upstairs. Mark's shoulders sagged, his bravado slipping away. "It's not what you think," he muttered, but the fight in his voice was gone. I turned away, my own calm startling even me. The man I had once feared losing was already lost. What remained was the truth and the beginning of his undoing. The days that followed were filled with ripples from that evening. Pamela told me quietly that whispers had spread through the school community, carried by guests who had attended the banquet. Harold called to assure me that Walter now knew, though he had chosen to keep his silence in public out of dignity. Denise reached out with unexpected kindness, offering her support should I need it. Mark sensed the shift too, the way people treated him differently, the way doors that once opened easily began to close. At home, he grew restless, pacing at night, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. Tessa stopped visiting altogether, her sudden absence louder than her presence had ever been. When Mark asked me what I wanted, I told him only this: the truth is no longer yours to hide. His face twisted with anger, but underneath, I saw fear. And that fear told me my quiet steps had finally become strides. The cracks were no longer hidden within my chest. They were spread across his world for all to see, and there would be no repairing them. The confrontation had begun, and I knew it was only the start. The collapse of his carefully built facade was coming piece by piece, and I no longer intended to stand in silence. In the weeks after Walter's banquet, the ripples grew into waves that neither Mark nor Tessa could contain. Whispers hardened into certainty, and certainty into judgment. At first, Mark tried to control the story. He told colleagues that I had overreacted, that my toast was a product of stress and exhaustion. But people had seen too much. They had watched his glances at Tessa, the flush of her cheeks, the undeniable language of two people who thought they were hiding in plain sight. Walter's disappointment came swiftly. He called me one evening, his voice steady but heavy with strain. "I raised my son to honor his word," he said quietly. "What I saw that night cannot be excused." It wasn't an easy admission for him, but it was the first sign that Mark's strongest ally was no longer willing to stand in his corner. Without his father's shield, Mark's confidence faltered. Tessa faced her own reckoning. Clients she had worked with for years began canceling contracts. A bride-to-be whose wedding she had been planning decided she didn't want her name attached to someone whispered about in church basements and grocery store aisles. Denise confided to me later that donors to the education fund had grown uneasy, not wanting events associated with scandal. In our small community, reputations could fall faster than they were built, and hers crumbled almost overnight. At home, Mark grew restless, pacing through rooms, his phone buzzing late at night with unanswered calls. He lashed out at small things, an unwashed dish, a misplaced bill, trying to reassert control where he still could. But his anger had lost its weight. I no longer cowered beneath it. Instead, I observed quietly each outburst, another piece of proof that he was unraveling. Lily noticed too. One evening, she asked gently, "Why is Dad so angry all the time?" I brushed a strand of hair from her face and whispered, "Because sometimes people don't know how to live with their own mistakes." The unraveling grew public when Mark's company announced a restructuring. His name, once associated with steady sales and leadership, was quietly omitted from the list of promoted executives. Rumors swirled that Harold, as chair of the education fund, had spoken candidly to business leaders about the importance of integrity. I never asked, but I suspected Harold's influence had carried further than I realized. Tessa attempted to shield herself by distancing from Mark, no longer meeting him in public, no longer responding with the same easy warmth. I overheard fragments when Mark spoke to her on the phone, his tone pleading, hers clipped. Eventually, the calls stopped altogether. One evening, he sat in the darkened living room, staring at his silent phone, as though waiting for it to light up again. It never did. By spring, invitations stopped arriving. Neighbors who once greeted us warmly now offered polite nods, their eyes avoiding his. He tried to cling to Lily, driving her to rehearsals, offering sudden bursts of attention that rang hollow. She accepted his gestures but turned to me afterward with quiet unease. "He feels different," she said softly. And I knew she was right. The mask he had worn for so long no longer fit. The final blow came from Walter. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, he called Mark to his home. I stayed behind folding laundry while Lily studied at the table. When Mark returned hours later, his face was ashen. He didn't speak, only retreated upstairs. Later, Walter phoned me, his words simple. "I told him he's on his own now. I can't stand beside deceit, even when it carries my name." The weight of those words settled over me, a confirmation that the collapse was complete. Not long after, I received a message from Denise. The board had voted unanimously to remove Tessa from her planning role in upcoming projects. "We believe in second chances," Denise told me, "but not when trust is broken deliberately." It was said kindly, but the meaning was clear. Tessa had lost the community she once anchored. Mark's world narrowed further. His office reduced his responsibilities, his friendships thinned, and the money he once controlled so confidently slipped through his fingers. He tried to blame me in hushed arguments, claiming I had orchestrated his downfall. I didn't answer. The truth didn't need my defense. It had spoken for itself in every room, every whisper, every door now closed to him. One night, after another failed attempt to reach Tessa, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders slumped. "Do you hate me?" he asked quietly. I studied him for a long moment before answering. "No, Mark, I don't hate you. I simply stopped believing the man you pretended to be." He flinched, as though the calmness in my tone struck harder than any anger could. From that night forward, the house felt lighter. Lily still carried questions, but she leaned into me more, sensing the steadiness I was reclaiming. Pamela remained a quiet support, her presence reminding me that trust could still exist. And I moved through my days no longer as the woman silenced by betrayal, but as someone who had witnessed justice take its course, in ways both quiet and public. The collapse was no longer a hope or a plan. It was real unfolding around us, and Mark stood powerless in the ruins he had built himself. And yet, even in that collapse, I knew my journey wasn't finished. The final step remained, choosing what came after, and how I would reclaim not just dignity, but freedom. The weeks after Mark's downfall brought a strange quiet into my life. The house that had once felt heavy with secrets grew lighter, even though the same furniture filled the rooms. Lily and I began spending evenings in the kitchen, cooking together, the warmth of her laughter filling spaces that had been silent for too long. I no longer felt the need to glance at Mark's empty chair with dread. Instead, I felt the relief of knowing that seat no longer held control over me. Walter reached out often, his voice softer now, carrying both sorrow and resolve. He apologized for his son, though I reminded him gently that Mark's choices were not his to bear. Lily visited her grandfather on weekends, and I could see the comfort they both found in each other. Harold checked in too steady, as always, reminding me that truth has a way of finding its own witness. Pamela never asked for details, but her quiet support became a constant thread, grounding me on the days when the past still tried to press its weight on my chest. As for Tessa, she faded from our lives without ceremony. Word spread quickly that her business had lost too many clients to recover, and she left town quietly, no farewell, no explanation. I didn't seek her out. Some endings require no confrontation, only distance. And Mark, his path narrowed with every choice he had made. When Lily mentioned he was working odd jobs and living alone, I listened quietly, offering her comfort without bitterness. He had built his own solitude. My heart no longer carried the burden of his decisions. In the stillness that followed, I found myself again. I returned to small joys that had slipped away during years of suspicion and silence. Long walks in the park after school, tending to the garden. My mother once taught me to love evenings with a book and a cup of tea instead of waiting for footsteps on the stairs. I began to feel whole in ways I hadn't in years. My freedom wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, gentle, and deeply mine. Looking back, I realized that revenge wasn't the sharp strike of exposing them in front of everyone, though that moment had its power. Real revenge was in reclaiming the pieces of myself that had been dulled by betrayal. Justice had come through truth unfolding in its own time, stripping away their lies until only the consequences remained. What I gained was not triumph over them, but dignity within myself. I learned that silence can be both prison and weapon. For months, it had kept me trapped, carrying pain no one could see. But when I chose to use it with purpose, silence became strength. My quiet steps built the foundation for their collapse. And in the end, when their noise was all rage and excuses, my stillness spoke louder. Now, when I think of the woman I was before all this, I feel compassion for her. She believed stability was enough, that loyalty could shield her from betrayal. She wept in the dark, thinking she had no power. But she was stronger than she knew, and she carried me here. Life feels different now. Not perfect, not without scars, but real. I have Lily by my side, steady friendships, and a community that stood with me when I needed it most. I hold no illusions about the past, but I carry no bitterness either. The freedom I gained is more valuable than anything I lost. Before we close, I'd love to know, have you ever found strength in a moment you thought might break you. Share your reflections in the comments, and if these stories speak to you, stay connected here for more.